In the humid, stifling heat of November in 1864, the city of Asunción, the capital of Paraguay, was wrapped in an oppressive atmosphere that seemed almost tangible. The air itself shimmered, hazy and heavy, over the city's red-tiled rooftops and sprawling orange groves, pulsating with an intensity that made it feel as though it was molten glass stretched under an unforgiving sun. Nearby, the mighty Paraguay River appeared sluggish and dense, its waters resembling thick, motionless oil, unmoving and unnerving in their stillness. Though the streets lay eerily quiet, this silence was not one of peace or tranquility, rather, it was filled with tension and anticipation. Every soft rustle, every distant shout of a water porter, echoed loudly in the hearts of the town's inhabitants, magnified by the suffocating stillness that hung over the city. It felt as if the entire nation was holding its breath, fixated on a single, formidable building, the grand, formidable palace of the government. Its walls, austere and imposing, stood as a stark symbol of authority amid the oppressive atmosphere. Inside this stately palace, in the cool shadows of his office, sat a man whose hands held not only the fate of the land but also the hopes and fears of its people. His name was Francisco Solano López, the Marshal and President of the Republic of Paraguay. His face, usually marked by a self-assured expression of authority and pride, was now deeply contorted with a look of stern contemplation. Before him lay a report, disturbing, heavy with implications. Just beyond the window, the reflection of the river shimmered, contrasting sharply with the storm raging inside his mind. The report detailed that Brazil, a colossal empire looming over the continent like a giant shadow, had deployed its troops into Uruguay to overthrow the legitimate government allied with Paraguay. This was the incident, what in diplomatic terms could be called the casus belli, a perfect pretext for war. López had anticipated such a move but dreaded its true consequences. His gaze drifted toward the shining surface of the river, where a Brazilian steamer, the Marques de Alegra, was moored at the dock, bearing the newly appointed governor of the Brazilian province of Mato Grosso. Seizing that vessel, taking it by force, would be more than just an act of defiance, it would be a humiliating insult to Emperor Pedro II, a provocative affront that could push the continent toward chaos. That was a step into an abyss from which there would be no return. At that moment, no one in the world could fathom the true scale of the impending catastrophe. Few could grasp that this small, isolated country tucked in the heart of South America, barely visible on most European maps, would dare to challenge not only the mighty Brazilian Empire but also its ambitious neighbor, the Argentine Republic, and their puppet state, Uruguay. No one could foresee that in the years to come, the continent would be engulfed in 6 years of unparalleled agony, bloodshed, and destruction, the most brutal war in its history. Fields of lush greenery would transform into scorched, barren wastelands, and once thriving cities would lie in ruins, choking on smoke and destruction. The war would nearly annihilate Paraguay's male population, leaving behind a nation of widows and orphans, scarred and broken. On the battlefields, hardened veterans of 3 armies would stand alongside aging old men and 8-year-old boys, their faces sometimes hidden behind false beards they had hurriedly attached in a desperate attempt to appear older and more formidable. That suffocating November day, amidst the sweltering heat and mounting pressure, Francisco Solano López made his fateful decision. He gave the order, chaos erupting as Paraguayan cannons seized the Brazilian steamer. The threads of fate had been woven tightly into a bloody knot. The great clock of history now ticked backward toward tragedy and disaster. This story is none other than the account of the War of the Triple Alliance, more widely known as the Paraguayan War. It's a narrative recounting acts of unparalleled heroism intertwined with acts of monstrous cruelty, moments of shining victory torn apart by crushing defeat. It's a history of unwavering loyalty and devotion to a leader, contrasted starkly with the madness of a dictator who dragged his nation into the depths of destruction and despair. This is a lament for a nation that dared to stand alone against the entire world and paid a devastating, unimaginable price for such defiance. To truly understand how a small, landlocked country like Paraguay decided to embark upon a seemingly suicidal war against 3 powerful neighbors, it is essential to journey back to the very origins of Paraguayan independence. Because in mid-19th century South America, Paraguay was far more than just a sovereign state. It was an anomaly, a rare and extraordinary phenomenon on the global political map. It was born from the will of a single individual, a man both a genius and a dictator, whose shadow continued to loom over the land long after his death. The name of this man was José Gaspar Rodríguez de Francia, yet history remembers him as El Supremo, meaning the Supreme. During a time when South America was aflame with revolutionary fervor, when revolutionaries inspired by figures like Simón Bolívar and José de San Martín worked tirelessly to redraw the continent's political landscape, creating new republics often torn apart by civil wars, ambitions of caudillos, and intricate foreign intrigues, Francia charted a vastly different course for Paraguay. After seizing power in 1814, this stern, ascetic, and highly suspicious intellectual, who was also a lawyer and theologian, concluded that the only way to preserve Paraguay's fragile sovereignty in a hostile ring of surrounding nations was complete isolation. In his eyes, the only safeguard was to cut the country off entirely from external influences, shutting it behind an impenetrable curtain. He ordered the construction of a literal iron curtain across the borders, sealing off all external contact. External trade was banned outright, and entry or exit from the country was permitted solely with his personal authorization and approval he almost never granted. Any foreigner daring to cross the border risked becoming a permanent alien within Paraguay's borders, effectively imprisoned in a foreign land without hope of escape. Behind these tightly shut doors, Francia built a state unlike any other in the world, one rooted in radical self-sufficiency and strict control. He dismantled the power of the old Spanish colonial elite and the Catholic Church, confiscating their lands and assets, thus stripping away their influence over the country's economy and social order. He established an economy entirely under state control, where practically all land and industry belonged to the government. Peasants worked on state-owned estates called Estancias del Patria, producing food that rendered the country fully self-sufficient. The state monopolized the production of yerba mate and tobacco, its principal exports, which however, were hardly exported beyond Paraguay's borders. Remarkably, the country had no external debt and no internal poverty or hunger, yet neither did it possess the wealth recognized in Europe. Paraguay was a Spartan utopia, built on the principles of absolute control, self-reliance, and xenophobia. Francia wielded power with an iron hand. He created an extensive network of spies and informants to crush any dissent at its root, punishing any conspiracy, true or false, with ruthless severity. Fear of him was widespread, many regarded him as a semi-divine figure. His eccentricities were legendary. He demanded that people turn away, fall to the ground, or hide when he approached, insisting that no one should ever behold the face of the Supreme. Despite his formidable persona, he led a modest life, residing in a simple house, dressed in an old, worn frock coat, and personally inspecting military barracks and workshops to oversee the nation's defense. Francia also forged a formidable army well-trained, albeit archaic in armament, that served as both the guardian of his rule and the protector of Paraguay's independence. His military was the backbone of the nation's sovereignty, a testament to his relentless pursuit of a sovereign, isolated Paraguay. This shadowy, formidable figure remains a complex symbol, part visionary, part tyrant, whose legacy forever altered the course of Paraguayan history. For more than 40 years, beginning in the year of his ascension in and continuing until, he alone held sway over Paraguay's destiny. During this period, he transformed the country into a fortress state, isolated from the outside world, yet internally unified and remarkably stable. His rule created a self-contained society, cut off from external influences, but tightly held together within its own borders. When, in the year 1840, El Supremo died without naming a successor, many believed that his unique, tightly controlled system would inevitably collapse. However, to everyone's surprise, it endured against the odds. Following a brief period of instability and uncertainty, power was consolidated by Carlos Antonio López's nephew, a shrewd and somewhat portly man named López. Unlike his austerely disciplined uncle, this pragmatic and cunning figure understood that perpetual isolation was no longer realistic or sustainable. Recognizing the need to modernize, he embarked on a cautious process of opening Paraguay to the broader world. This involved restoring and expanding trade relations, inviting European engineers, doctors, and architects to help develop the country's infrastructure, and beginning a series of significant reforms. Under his leadership, Paraguay saw the construction of its first railway, an extraordinary achievement for South America at that time, and the establishing of important industrial facilities, like a foundry and an arsenal. Nevertheless, even as he sought to modernize and open the nation, López Sr. remained committed to core principles rooted in the previous era. He preserved and even reinforced the fundamental aspects of his predecessor's system, notably maintaining high levels of state control over the economy and upholding an authoritarian form of governance. Paraguay, under his rule, was a country devoid of political opposition, all power was concentrated in the hands of the president. The Lopez family, having amassed enormous wealth, effectively privatized the state's resources, consolidating authority and privilege within their own lineage. By the early 1860s, Paraguay represented a true regional phenomenon. It was a stable and prosperous nation, characterized by a heavily militarized society that operated without external debts, boasting a burgeoning economy and having the most formidable, best-equipped army in the region. The Paraguayans, raised amidst an environment of isolation and a sense of national exceptionalism, became fiercely dedicated to their homeland and its leader. They grew accustomed to unquestioning obedience, believing fervently that their Paraguay was a land divinely protected and guided by divine will, governed by wise rulers who knew best. It was within this context, this legacy rooted in pride, seclusion, and hidden strength, that the son of Carlos Antonio Lopez inherited the throne. This young man, a brigadier general named Francisco Solán López, inherited a perfectly calibrated military machine and a populace ready to follow him into any battle. Yet, he inherited more than just military prowess, he also inherited xenophobia, arrogance, and a dangerous ignorance of the realities beyond his fortress's borders. He saw himself not merely as the ruler of Paraguay but as a regional destiny shaper, convinced that the moment had come for Paraguay to cast its influence across the continent. Believing that his army was capable of asserting dominance, he thought that Paraguay could dictate terms not only to fractured Argentina but also to imperial Brazil. This overconfidence, born from the unique historical and cultural soil of Paraguay, became the spark that ignited a continent-wide firestorm. While Paraguay, under the wise yet heavy-handed rule of Lopez's father, was transforming into what could be called a South American Sparta, an intensely militarized society far removed from the concerns of broader statecraft, an entirely different boy was growing up far away. This boy was destined to become both the greatest hero and the worst curse of his nation. Named Francisco Solán López, he would soon become famous around the world, his name a symbol of fanatic patriotism and terrifying tyranny alike. His ascent to power, driven by insatiable ambition, deep-seated insecurities, and a perilous love, would set him on a path toward both the heights of national greatness and the depths of catastrophe. Born in the year of 1827, Francisco was the eldest son of Carlos Antonio López. His childhood and youth were shrouded in the shadow of his formidable father, who meticulously prepared him to inherit and continue his legacy. From an early age, he was immersed in the doctrines of patriotism, discipline, and authority, traits that would shape his worldview and his future reign. Although he never received a formal, systematic education, his father took great care to ensure that his son mastered several languages and developed a solid understanding of military affairs. From an early age, young Lopez was showered with titles and entrusted with important positions, demonstrating the confidence placed in him by his family and society. By the age of 18, he had already achieved the rank of brigadier general and was serving as the commander of the Paraguayan army, an impressive feat for such a young man. His father trusted him with delicate diplomatic missions, viewing him as the natural successor to carry on their family's legacy of power and influence. However, beneath the surface of outward obedience and eagerness to serve, the young general harbored a dangerous mix of pride, vanity, and an intense desire to prove his worth to the world and, most importantly, to his father. A pivotal moment in Lopez's life occurred during a lengthy journey across Europe in the years 1853 and 1854. Officially, he was there to negotiate trade agreements and purchase military supplies. In reality, this voyage served as a window into the world of high politics, imperial grandeur, and military pageantry that fascinated him. Throughout his travels, Lopez was received by Queen Victoria in London, met with Pope Pius IX at the Vatican, and was profoundly impressed by Emperor Napoleon II during his visit to France. Among these encounters, it was the meeting with Napoleon in France that left the deepest mark on him. The French Empire, with its cult of military glory, imperial ambitions, and a powerful leader at its head, became Lopez's idol and ultimate inspiration. He envisioned himself as a South American Napoleon, destined to forge his own empire in the vast basin of the Paraguay River. Eager to emulate his imperial ideals, he bought tons of weapons, ordered uniforms tailored according to Parisian fashion, and eagerly absorbed the atmosphere of great power politics. His passion for military grandeur and imperial aspirations grew stronger with each passing day. It was in Paris that a fateful meeting took place, a moment that would forever alter the course of his life. Within the salons of the Second Empire, he encountered Isa Lynch, an Irish courtesan, adventurous, and stunning beauty. This woman, sharp-minded, fiercely determined, and driven by an insatiable hunger for wealth and power, quickly captured the heart of the Paraguayan general. She became his lover, trusted advisor, and lifelong companion, exerting a powerful influence over him. Upon returning to Asunción, Lynch brought with her Parisian fashions, European manners, and imperial ambitions, which she constantly stoked in her ambitious lover. She effectively became the unrecognized Queen of Paraguay, shaping its fashion and social scene, yet, for the conservative Paraguayan society, she remained an outsider, a morally dubious foreign influence with a corrupting effect on their ruler. When in 1862 Carlos Antonio López died, Francisco Solano López seamlessly inherited his authority, quickly maneuvering the Congress to declare him president for a full decade. He inherited a country with a full treasury, a formidable army, and a compliant population, but this was not enough for him. López craved fame and recognition, and he saw Paraguay not merely as a thriving regional power but as an arbiter and hegemon capable of standing against the Brazilian Empire and the Argentine Republic. This delusion of grandeur, amplified by the country's military strength, turned him into a highly dangerous player in the already volatile political landscape of South America. So, what kind of man was Francisco Solano López? Contemporary observers and historians alike paint a deeply contradictory portrait of him, capturing both his ambitions and flaws in stark relief. On one hand, he was undeniably courageous, full of energy, and possessed a certain level of strategic insight. He genuinely believed in the greatness of Paraguay and was willing to sacrifice everything in his efforts to defend its independence. In the eyes of many Paraguayans, he remains to this day the greatest national hero, a martyr who fell in battle against overwhelming enemy forces. On the other hand, his leadership, especially during the years of war, was marred by extreme cruelty and paranoia. He was intensely self-absorbed, intolerant of even the slightest disagreement, and perceived treachery everywhere. His failures on the battlefield he attributed solely to betrayal and treason. Under his orders, thousands of individuals were executed, including his own brothers, ministers, generals, bishops, and hundreds of foreign nationals. His suspicious nature evolved into a form of terror that drained the nation's strength no less than enemy gunfire. Was he a madman, a cold-blooded tyrant, or a tragic figure shattered by the unbearable weight of a war he himself had unleashed? The answer to this question remains a subject of fierce debate even today. Yet, what is certain is that the personality of Francisco Solano López, along with his ambitions, fears, and love for Isa Lynch, served as the catalyst that ignited the powder keg of the region known as Los La Platas. To understand why the spark ignited by López turned into an all-consuming blaze, one must look at the geopolitical map of the Los La Platas region in the mid-19th century. It was a turbulent, restless world, fraught with ancient grudges, unresolved boundary disputes, and unfulfilled imperial ambitions. The three main actors, namely the Brazilian Empire, the Argentine Republic, and the isolated Paraguay, stood in a delicate balance that could be shattered at any moment. Between them, like a wedge of discord, lay the small and perpetually unstable country of Uruguay. The Brazilian Empire loomed as a giant in the region. Vast in territory with a large population, it had, unlike its Spanish-speaking neighbors, managed to preserve a monarchy and political stability after gaining independence. Under the wise rule of Emperor Pedro II, Brazil aimed to establish its dominance across the continent. Its foreign policy focused on countering Argentina, its main rival, and ensuring free navigation along the Parana and Paraguay rivers. These rivers were vital arteries connecting inland Brazilian territories, such as Mato Grosso, with the Atlantic Ocean. Any threat to this communication route was perceived in Rio de Janeiro as a direct threat to national security. Brazil actively intervened in Uruguay's internal affairs, supporting friendly political forces and watching with growing concern as Paraguay militarized under the López family. Argentina, the second giant of the region, was a land divided. For decades after independence, the country was torn apart by a bloody civil war between the Unitarians, advocates of a centralized government seated in Buenos Aires, and the Federalists, who championed provincial autonomy. By the early 1860s, the Unitarians, led by President Bartolomé Mitre, had achieved a significant victory. Yet, despite this milestone, the Argentine nation was still far from being truly united in spirit and territory. President Mitre was deeply committed to restoring what he perceived as the historical borders of the Viceroyalty of the Rio de la Plata. This ambitious goal entailed the annexation of Paraguay and Uruguay, both countries that Argentina had never fully recognized as entirely independent entities. In addition to these ambitions, Buenos Aires also laid claim to extensive disputed territories in the Gran Chaco region. Paraguay, on its part, considered these lands to be rightfully theirs. As a result, a profound and ongoing territorial conflict simmered beneath the surface, a conflict that was seemingly waiting for an opportune moment to ignite. Meanwhile, Paraguay, often seen as the dark horse in this complex geopolitical game, stood out as a resilient and self-sufficient nation. Economically, it thrived independently, and politically, it remained remarkably stable given its regional circumstances. Paraguay boasted an army that, in terms of numbers and, by Paraguayan standards, impressive combat capabilities, seemed to outmatch its neighbors. Its leader, Marshal Francisco Solano López, viewed himself as a guardian of regional balance. López believed that no major power, neither Brazil nor Argentina, should be allowed to interfere with impunity in the affairs of smaller countries like Uruguay. To strengthen this stance, López forged an alliance with the ruling Blanco Party in Uruguay, which symbolized the whites, and sought to build a coalition with the Argentine federals, opponents of the central government led by Mitre. This proactive, almost aggressive diplomatic approach was entirely new for Paraguay, long regarded as a relatively isolated nation. It stirred considerable resentment and concern in both Rio de Janeiro and Buenos Aires, where policymakers viewed López's policies with growing unease. Meanwhile, the small neighboring state of Uruguay, squeezed between these two giants, constantly became a battleground for their competing interests. Its own political life was sharply divided between two rival parties, the conservative Blancos, led by Atanasio Aquino Aguirre, and the liberal Colorado Party, headed by Venancio Flores. The Colorado Party, meaning colored, traditionally drew support from the urban middle class and the commercial bourgeoisie of Montevideo. It sought closer ties with Paraguay and had cozy, often covert, relations with Brazil and Argentina. Conversely, the Blanco Party relied heavily on rural constituencies and aimed at an alliance with Paraguay, advocating a more conservative outlook. It was precisely this internal political tension within Uruguay that ignited the crisis which would eventually propel the entire region toward conflict. In the year of 1863, the leader of the Colorado Party, Venancio Flores, taking advantage of covert military and financial support from Argentina and with the silent backing of Brazil, launched a rebellion against the legitimate government of the Blancos. The uprising was a direct challenge to the existing political order. In response, Aguirre's government initiated brutal repression against the many Brazilian settlers residing in Uruguay. This crackdown provided Brazil with the long-awaited justification to intervene in Uruguay's internal affairs. By the year of 1864, Brazil issued an ultimatum to Uruguay and subsequently stationed its troops within Uruguayan territory, ostensibly to support Flores' rebellion. Francisco Solano López, the Paraguayan leader, perceived this Brazilian intervention as a red line and existential threat not only to Uruguay but to regional stability altogether. López saw Brazil's military incursions as a harbinger of broader aggression, including towards Paraguay itself. He firmly believed that if now, in Uruguay, his regional allies and friends fell, the next targets would be Paraguay and possibly Argentina. In August of 1864, López sent a formal protest note to Brazil, denouncing the occupation and asserting that Paraguay would not remain passive in the face of such encroachments. He made it clear that he would no longer watch idly as a foreign power seized control of a neighboring nation by force. However, the Brazilian authorities dismissed López's protests, ignoring the Paraguayan leader's warnings. To López, this disregard was not merely an insult but a grave affront, one that threatened to escalate the crisis into a larger regional conflict. The trap had finally snapped shut, with no way back. Pride and ambition, long-standing territorial disputes, and relentless struggles for regional dominance had all become entangled into a single, tight knot of geopolitical tension. War, which once seemed distant and unlikely, now appeared inevitable, hanging over the continent like a dark cloud. The ultimatum issued by López to the Brazilian Empire was dismissed with a cold indifference that only a great, powerful nation could afford, a dismissiveness that grew from a history of habitually ignoring the concerns of smaller neighbors. In response, the Brazilian Navy, under Admiral Tamandaré, entered Uruguayan waters, while imperial troops crossed the border, posing a direct threat. For Lopez, this was no mere political setback, it was a profound personal insult. A man who saw himself as the Napoleon of the New World was suddenly and publicly relegated to insignificance, his opinions ignored as if they held no weight. This affront prompted Lopez to react in a manner characteristic of his temperament, bold, reckless, and driven by desperation. On the 11th of November, in the year 1864, under Lopez's explicit orders, the Paraguayan gunboat Taquari intercepted and seized the Brazilian mail and passenger steamer named Marquis of Olinda on the Paraguay River. The vessel was en route along its usual path from Rio de Janeiro to the city of Corumbá, which served as the capital of the Brazilian province of Mato Grosso. On board were not only valuable cargo and a significant sum of money, but also the newly appointed governor of that province, Colonel Federico Carneiro Campos. The steamer was taken to Asunción, the Paraguayan capital. Its cargo and the money were confiscated, while the passengers and crew, including the provincially appointed governor, were thrown into Paraguayan prisons, where many of them would ultimately perish from disease and mistreatment. This act was, in essence, piracy committed amid peacetime, a declaration of war expressed not through diplomatic channels but through a single salvo from a ship's cannon. The news of the Marquis of Olinda's capture ignited a firestorm of outrage in Rio de Janeiro. Public sentiment, which had previously paid little mind to Paraguayan affairs, now erupted with fury. Newspapers blared with headlines condemning the insult to national honor and demanded swift, severe retaliation. Emperor Pedro II and his government could no longer turn a blind eye to Lopez's actions. The declaration of war between Paraguay and Brazil became an undeniable reality. Yet Lopez, unshaken, chose not to wait for a formal response. Instead, he decided to strike preemptively, leveraging Paraguay's greatest strength at that moment, the complete combat readiness of his army. While Brazil was only beginning the slow, arduous process of mobilizing scattered forces across its vast territory, Lopez attacked the most vulnerable flank of the empire, the distant and poorly defended province of Mato Grosso. In December of that same year, Paraguayan forces, divided into two columns, invaded Brazilian territory. One column, numbering around 4,000 men under the command of General Vicente Barrientos, descended the Paraguay River on ships, while the other, led by Colonel Isidoro Rescal, advanced overland. His plan was straightforward yet remarkably effective: seize key Brazilian forts and towns along the river, cut the province off from the rest of the empire, and seize significant military trophies and resources. The campaign's initial successes were sharply impressive, catching the Brazilian forces off guard and setting the stage for a conflict that would soon escalate into a full-scale war. The diminutive Paraguayan garrisons, poorly prepared and lacking sufficient troop numbers, proved unable to mount any substantial resistance against the advancing forces. One after another, the Paraguayan fortresses Coimbra, Albuquerque, and Dourados fell swiftly into the hands of the invaders. By the month of January, the Paraguayan troops had managed to seize control of the largest city in the province of Corumbá, followed shortly thereafter by the strategic city of Miranda. The riches accumulated there, massive stores of weaponry, ammunition, food supplies, and livestock, soon became a vital asset for the Paraguayan military. Particularly valuable was the arsenal in Corumbá, which contained a large stockpile of modern firearms and advanced weaponry, transforming it into an invaluable acquisition that bolstered Paraguay's arsenal considerably. This series of victories resulted in the entire southern part of the state of Mato Grosso falling under Lopez's control, giving him a significant strategic advantage. These initial successes inflated the Paraguayan dictator's confidence. They prompted a surge of euphoria among his troops and supporters, and even stirred a sense of arrogance and invincibility. Within the camp, soldiers and officers began to believe they were unstoppable, and Lopez himself grew more convinced that his chosen path was the correct one. It seemed as though his audacious plan was unfolding precisely as he had envisioned, leading him to believe that mighty Brazil was nothing more than a paper tiger, easily subdued. Yet, this apparent triumph was ultimately deceptive and illusory. Strategically, the campaign in Mato Grosso proved to be a costly mistake. Lopez had diverted his most capable forces to a secondary theater of war, an isolated and sparsely populated region, while the vital conflict front was shifting further south, into the basin of the Parana River. Conquering a remote and hardly inhabited province could not deliver a decisive blow to Brazil. Nevertheless, this diversion of resources was dangerous. It drained Paraguay's strength at a critical moment when the main phase of conflict was approaching, and the resources expended in Mato Grosso would soon be desperately needed elsewhere, where the battle lines were intensifying. Moreover, this aggressive move unequivocally alarmed the Argentine government, which now recognized López as a threat not only to Brazil but to all neighboring countries in the region. The Argentine president, Mitre, who had so far maintained a cautious and reserved stance, now found clear justification to organize an anti-Paraguayan coalition. While Paraguayan soldiers celebrated their victory in the captured city of Corumbu, behind closed doors in Buenos Aires and Rio de Janeiro, a deadly alliance was being forged, one that would soon transform the conflict from Paraguay's war against Brazil into a broader and more dangerous war against all of its neighbors. Having been emboldened by their easy victories in Mato Grosso, López was convinced that the time had come for a decisive strike. His military strategy was bold and heavily risky. He decided to shift the war's focus onto enemy territory by marching into Uruguay, defeating the Brazilian forces stationed there, and reinstating his allies from the Blanco Party to power. This daring maneuver promised not only military glory but also the opportunity to drastically alter the regional political landscape by depriving Brazil of its foothold in Uruguay. Still, there was a significant obstacle on López's way to realizing this bold plan: Argentina. Early in the year 1865, López approached the Argentine president, Bartolomé Mitre, requesting permission for his army to cross through Argentina's Corrientes province. López naively believed that Mitre, being a long-standing rival of Brazil, would either support his endeavor or at least remain neutral. This was a colossal misjudgment. Mitre had no intention of assisting López, quite the contrary. He saw the Paraguayan leader's request as an ideal pretext to enter the conflict himself, aiming to settle long-standing territorial disputes in his favor. The response from Buenos Aires was a firm and unequivocal refusal. For López, this rejection was a further insult and confirmation of his suspicions that neighboring powers had conspired against Paraguay in secret. With no permission granted, López resolved to seize control by force, believing that military action was the only way to achieve his ambitions. On the 18th of March in the year 1865, an extraordinary session of the Paraguayan Congress took place in Asunción, a session that was little more than a puppet gathering, controlled entirely by the dictator, López. During this pivotal meeting, López delivered a fiery and impassioned speech, charging Argentina with hostile actions against Paraguay. His words were aimed at rallying support and justifying further aggressive measures. As a result, the Congress issued a declaration of war against the government of Mitre, the Argentine leader, marking a significant escalation in the growing conflict. In recognition of his pivotal role in this decision, López was elevated to the highest military rank, marshalling, and granted extraordinary powers that bolstered his authority over military and political affairs. In his address, he uttered prophetic words that would later serve as a rallying cry for Paraguayan resistance, statements that encapsulated the nation's unwavering resolve: even if their enemies triumphed in battle, victory would not grant them the right to humiliate or subjugate Paraguay, a nation they all vowed to defend at all costs. Fast forward to the 13th of April of the same year, more than a month before the official declaration of war reached Buenos Aires, an audacious act of military aggression unfolded. The Paraguayan river fleet launched a surprise attack on Argentine ships anchored in the port of Corrientes. The following day, Paraguayan troops mounted a swift and unopposed landing in the city and rapidly seized control, marking the beginning of an invasion into Argentine territory. This sudden assault was viewed by López and his government as a masterstroke, providing what they considered a gift to their cause. It allowed them to frame the ensuing conflict not as an aggressive conquest, but as a righteous struggle against a treacherous aggressor, an act of patriotic resistance rather than imperial domination. The news of the attack on Corrientes sparked an explosion of patriotic fervor among the Argentine population. Crowds poured into the streets, their anger and outrage fueling demands for decisive action against the Paraguayan dictator, López. Volunteers flocked to enlist in the army, eager to defend their homeland from the invading forces. The Argentine leadership, under Mitre, famously declared that within 3 days soldiers would be in the barracks, within 3 weeks in Corrientes, and within 3 months in Asunción. However, no one could have predicted that this war, initially expected to be swift, would stretch on for nearly 6 years, far exceeding the early expectations of a rapid victory. On the 1st of May in the year 1865, an important diplomatic milestone occurred. Representatives of Brazil, Argentina, and the newly established puppet government of Uruguay led by Vinicius Flores signed a treaty that came to be known as the Triple Alliance Pact. For a long time, the contents of this agreement remained shrouded in secrecy, but its implications were far more sinister than a simple defensive alliance. This treaty embodied a comprehensive plan to destroy López's regime and to carve up Paraguay's territory among the Allies. The document stipulated that hostilities would continue until López's government was overthrown. Paraguay, under this pact, was to be disarmed, a process that meant dismantling its fortresses and forced to pay an enormous war indemnity to the Allied nations. Yet, the most cynical parts of the treaty were kept hidden. Clandestine provisions outlined plans for territorial annexations. According to these secret articles, Argentina was to gain the entire Gran Chaco region, while Brazil was to claim vast areas to the north and east of the Parana and Apa rivers. If these terms were fully realized, Paraguay would be stripped of more than half of its land, reducing it to a tiny, unviable state, nothing more than a shadow of its former self. When, in the year of 1866, the details of this treaty leaked into the press, thanks to British diplomats, it ignited a wave of outrage across South America and even reached parts of Europe. Many observed that the treaty was clear evidence of the war's true nature, not as a struggle for liberation, but as a calculated and ruthless act of conquest. For the Paraguayan people, this leak was a stark confirmation that their fight was not merely against López's tyranny but was an existential struggle to preserve their very nationhood. This revelation intensified their determination, fueling their resolve to fight to the bitter end. Meanwhile, Paraguayan military operations advanced, and López divided his forces into separate contingents to better manage the ongoing conflict. The war's progression was marked by strategic maneuvers and fierce battles, with López's military leadership facing numerous challenges but maintaining relentless resistance against the combined militias of the Triple Alliance. Under his personal command, one of the Paraguayan columns was tasked with advancing downstream along the Parana River, relying heavily on support from the naval fleet. Meanwhile, another column, led by Lieutenant Colonel Antonio de la Cruz Estigarribia, was destined to cross the Argentine province of Misiones. Their objective was to reach the Uruguay River and move southward, with the ultimate goal of uniting with the first column. This combined force was intended to strike a decisive blow against Brazil. On paper, this plan seemed brilliantly conceived, a strategic two-pronged approach designed to stretch the enemy's defenses and deliver a crushing assault on Brazilian territory. However, it failed to account for the true complexities of the terrain, the difficulties in maintaining supply lines, or the escalating resistance encountered from the Argentine defenders. The Paraguayan army, overshooting its initial confidence, rushed into foreign lands with a reckless resolve, only to find itself nearing its first major catastrophe. While the land columns of the Paraguayan forces advanced with ferocity through Argentine territory, Saldanha López understood that the true key to victory, indeed, the salvation of his campaign, lay on the water. Control over the Parana River was absolutely vital, not only for providing supplies to his advancing troops but also for facilitating the further movement of Casuzo's forces downstream. An obstacle stood in their way, a formidable Brazilian squadron that had entrenched itself in the river, effectively blocking any passage southward. Recognizing the importance of this naval obstacle, López resolved to engage the enemy fleet in a fierce battle, a decisive confrontation to crush the Brazilian squadron and clear the path for his forces to continue their southward push. This daring strategy led to one of the most significant and pivotal river battles in the history of warfare, the Battle of Riachuelo. Early on the morning of June 11, 1865, the Paraguayan fleet, consisting of 8 steam-powered gunboats and several gun sloops equipped with artillery, approached the Brazilian squadron's anchorage clandestinely. Their target was a narrow tributary of the Parana River called Riachuelo, a choke point critical to controlling access downstream. The Paraguayans' plan was audacious: launch a surprise attack by swiftly striking the seemingly immobile Brazilian ships, seizing them by boarding actions, and capturing their crews and vessels. The Brazilian squadron, commanded by Admiral Francisco Manuel Barros de Silva, comprised 9 steam corvettes and gunboats, forming a formidable force. Although the fleets were roughly evenly matched in numbers, the advantage in quality heavily tipped in favor of the Brazilians. Their ships were better armored, fitted with more modern and longer-range rifled artillery, arms that could strike accurately from a distance, unlike most of the Paraguayan artillery, which was mainly smoothbore and outdated. As dawn broke, the attack commenced. But the element of surprise was partially compromised from the outset. A technical failure on the flagship of the Paraguayans hindered their ability to execute the full surprise attack as planned. Nonetheless, their initial assault was fierce and vigorous. The Paraguayan ships, after passing by the Brazilian vessels under a hail of fire, turned around and engaged in close-quarters combat. What followed was a chaotic melee. Smoke from gunpowder billowed across the river, mingling with the roaring of cannons, the shouts of wounded sailors, and the cracking sounds of broken masts and splintering wood. The Paraguayans, true to their tactical doctrine, attempted to board the enemy vessels. Their flagship, the Taquari, rammed into a Brazilian ship in a daring collision. Despite being wounded severely, Commander Mesa refused to relinquish command, fighting tirelessly until he was finally struck down. At the most critical juncture of the battle, when it seemed the Paraguayans might succeed, Admiral Barroso made a bold and desperate decision. His flagship, the Amazonas, deftly veered away from direct confrontation, rushing upstream, then turning sharply and charging at the tangled Paraguayan vessels that had become lodged in the narrow strait. With full speed, he directed the Brazilian ships to break the Paraguayan line and seize the initiative in a fiercely fought, decisive engagement that would determine the fate of the river corridor and, ultimately, of the war effort. The Battle of the Paraguay River was a decisive turning point in the war, marked by a series of bold and destructive actions that forever altered the course of Paraguayan destiny. It all began when the formidable Amazonas, a powerful Brazilian warship, dramatically rammed and sank 3 of Paraguay's gunboats in quick succession. The destruction was swift and overwhelming, striking a blow that shook the confidence of the Paraguayan fleet. Not long after, other Brazilian vessels joined the attack, launching a fierce assault that demonstrated their military superiority in that moment. This intense engagement signaled a critical juncture. Paraguay's naval forces, once proud and perhaps overconfident, now faced a devastating setback. During the chaos, Paraguay lost multiple vessels and its commanding officer, which dealt a severe blow to their morale and operational cohesion. The remaining 4 gunboats, heavily damaged and bleeding from their wounds, made a desperate retreat. With engines reverberating at full throttle, they rushed upriver seeking safety behind the formidable battery defenses atop the fortress of Yumana. The fierce confrontation near Riachuela culminated in a crushing defeat for Paraguay. Out of their fleet of 8 of their best gunboats, they lost more than half, 4 ships wiped out, while the rest suffered extensive damage, rendering them practically useless for the remainder of the conflict. The human toll was staggering. Thousands of Paraguayan soldiers perished or were wounded in the chaos of the battle. Meanwhile, the Brazilian forces, although they also sustained some losses, managed to maintain complete control over the river, securing their strategic advantage along that vital waterway. The consequences of this naval catastrophe were disastrous for Paraguay's overall war plan conceived by Lopez. Firstly, his army, which was advancing along the riverbank in hopes of a swift victory, was suddenly cut off from vital supplies and reinforcements. With the river now under enemy control, their supply lines were severed, leaving the army stranded and vulnerable. The previously optimistic push along the river turned into a desperate retreat, forcing Lopez's forces to fall back northward amidst fierce fighting. Secondly, this defeat on the Uruguay River had serious repercussions for the broader strategic picture, particularly regarding Paraguay's fate. It decisively doomed the Second Paraguayan Column commanded by Estigarribia, which was maneuvering deep behind enemy lines. Once isolated from the main Paraguayan forces and lacking any hope of reinforcements, this entire division found itself surrounded by the superior Allied troops in the vicinity of Uruguayana. Faced with overwhelming odds, the beleaguered soldiers were forced into capitulation by September of 1865. Nearly 10,000 Paraguayan fighters surrendered, an overwhelming and humiliating loss. In just a few short months, Lopez's ambitious offensive had unraveled completely. He had lost nearly 1/3 of his army, along with the entire core of his naval fleet, both vital components of his plan to knock out the Allies quickly and decisively. The anticipated swift conquest of Uruguay and the unification of Paraguay's forces under a decisive victory crumbled before his eyes. What had once been an offensive strategy transformed into a defensive stand. From this point onward, the fighting had to be conducted on Paraguayan soil itself, turning their territory into a vast, fortified battleground. The battle at Riachuela became a strategic milestone, effectively marking the beginning of a protracted, grueling, and blood-soaked phase of the war. The Allies seized the initiative, their momentum no longer waning, and pressed forward with relentless determination. Paraguay, on the other hand, faced an extended and torturous defensive campaign that would ultimately turn the entire country into a giant, besieged fortress. It seemed as though the tide of war had turned irreversibly and end appeared inevitable. In the aftermath of the disaster at Riachuela and the capitulation of the Uruguayana army, the initial wave of optimism that had characterized the Allies' early confidence now gave way to a more somber reality. This sentiment was reflected weeks later in Asunción, when the renowned General Mitariri declared, perhaps prematurely, that victory was near. The tremendous force of the Triple Alliance, boasting over 50,000 troops, concentrated along Paraguay's southern borders, preparing for what they believed would be their final, decisive invasion. The war, from their perspective, seemed poised to conclude shortly. However, they greatly underestimated the resilience of Paraguay's terrain, the strength of its fortifications, and most importantly, the unwavering resolve of its people. The fierce patriotism and fanaticism that fueled the Paraguayans' willingness to fight unto death proved to be far more formidable than any military might could contend with. As a result, the conflict plunged into its longest, deadliest, and most bloodstained phase, the notorious Battle of Umana. The southern regions of Paraguay offered an ideal landscape for defensive warfare, a treacherous labyrinth of winding rivers, swampy wetlands, impenetrable forests, and dense reed thickets. Navigating such terrain was incredibly difficult for invading forces, leaving the only feasible approach from the south along the river Paraguay itself. It was precisely this route that Solano Lopez transformed into an almost impregnable series of fortifications, an elaborate defensive system known locally as the Quadrilatero, meaning the quadrilateral. This complex of fortifications and natural barriers turned the region into a fortress that enemies would find exceedingly difficult to breach. Through clever strategic planning and relentless preparation, Lopez ensured that the southern border of Paraguay was turned into a nearly unbreakable bastion, making the conquest of the country a far more complex and prolonged endeavor than the Allies had initially anticipated. Thus, the war's narrative shifted from a swift, victorious campaign to a grinding defensive struggle that would demand the utmost resilience from the Paraguayans and forever alter the course of their history. The defensive network that protected the capital of Paraguay was an intricate system comprised of 4 formidable fortresses: Umeda, Corapaiti, Paso de Patria, and Tuyuk. These fortifications were strategically positioned to dominate all approaches to the city, effectively creating an almost impenetrable barrier. Their powerful artillery batteries could fire across the river, ensuring control over any crossing points, while extensive lines of trenches and water-filled ditches extended for many kilometers, providing additional layers of protection from the landward side. At the heart of this formidable defensive arrangement stood the fortress of Umeda, a true citadel featuring thick walls, an array of dozens of artillery pieces, and a garrison numbering in the several thousands. This complex system was designed to withstand any assault and to serve as a bulwark against invading forces. In April of the year 1086, an Allied army crossed the Parana River and entered Paraguayan territory, confident they could break through the formidable defenses. However, they immediately found themselves caught in a deadly morass of fierce resistance, springing traps, landmines, some of which were explosive devices, and unexpected attacks launched by Paraguayan cavalry. Their advance was painfully slow and came at a very high cost, with significant casualties at every step. Despite the intense fighting and the heavy losses sustained, the worst was still to come. This was only the beginning of a brutal and protracted struggle. The turning point arrived on the 24th day of May in the year 1086, when the Allies launched a major assault on the first line of Paraguayan defenses near the small settlement of Tuyuti. President Lopez, determined to break the enemy's front, decided to commit nearly his entire army, almost 24,000 troops, to this vital confrontation. It unfolded into what is believed to be the bloodiest battle in the entire history of South America. Paraguayan soldiers, rallying with cries of "Long live Marshal Lopez," launched a frantic and desperate wave of attacks against the advancing forces. The combat that ensued was ferocious, lasting several hours of close-quarters combat, with soldiers fighting hand-to-hand amidst a landscape rapidly turning into a veritable hell. The battlefield was transformed into a scene of chaos and devastation beyond imagination. Despite the formidable display of heroism and determination among the Paraguayan fighters, their assault was ultimately thwarted. The Allies, possessing a superior artillery advantage, met the attacking forces with a relentless wall of gunfire, decimating the wave of Paraguayan attackers. By the end of that grueling day, the Paraguayan army had been utterly defeated. They suffered devastating losses, roughly 6,000 killed and 7,000 wounded, amounting to nearly half of their fighting force. The casualties among the Allied troops were also substantial, a weight of losses that their armies could ill afford. For a small nation like Paraguay, this was an irreversible and catastrophic blow. Following the Battle of Tuyuti, it appeared that the path to Asunción, the Paraguayan capital, was finally open. Yet, the defenders refused to capitulate and instead fell back to the next line of defense at the Coropite trenches, a strategic complex well prepared and effectively hidden. Instead of exploiting their victory, the Allied forces squandered several critical months, engaged in regrouping their armies and debating their next tactical moves. This pause allowed López precious time to fortify his positions and to gather the remnants of his army, which had suffered terribly in the previous clash. On the 22nd day of September in that same year, the Allied forces, under the command of the Argentine President Bartolomé Mitre, launched an all-out assault on the Coropite fortifications. This attack would go down as one of the most shameful episodes in the military history of the Alliance armies and, contrastingly, one of the most glorious moments for Paraguayan arms. The trenches at Coropite, located in an ideal strategic position and cleverly concealed, were under the command of one of Paraguay's most skilled generals, José Eduviges Diaz. As the Argentine and Brazilian battalions advanced, marched in parade-like formations accompanied by the blaring sounds of military bands, they were abruptly met with a deadly fusillade of artillery and infantry fire. Paraguayan defenders poured relentless volleys of bullets and artillery shells, causing catastrophic losses among the attacking troops. The toll was staggering. Within just a few hours of combat, the Allied forces lost anywhere from 4,000 to 9,000 men, according to different estimates, many of whom were killed outright. Paraguayan casualties, in contrast, numbered fewer than 100, marking an overwhelming defeat and a crushing victory for the defenders. The battle at Coropite galvanized the Paraguayan spirit, lifting morale and instilling a deep sense of pride among the defenders, even amid the devastation. The heroism of General Diaz, who later succumbed to an accidental wound sustained during the fighting, became legendary. This victory severely dampened the momentum of the Alliance armies and cast a pall over their subsequent campaigns, fueling despair at their perceived inability to break Paraguay's defenses. After this decisive victory, military activity practically came to a halt for more than a year, as the war transitioned into a grueling stalemate characterized by entrenched positions and protracted trench warfare. The conflict, once characterized by swift advances and open battles, now settled into a static, grim struggle for control over strategic points, with both sides enduring considerable hardships amid the endless cycle of defensive positions and limited offensives. The armies faced each other across the battlefield, not merely exhausted by combat, but gravely weakened by an insidious enemy that claimed countless lives beneath the chaos of war. Cholera, malaria, dysentery, and starvation ravaged soldiers on both sides with relentless brutality, claiming far more victims than enemy fire ever did. Encampments, once strategic military strongholds, had transformed into sprawling hospitals teeming with the sick and dying, while simultaneously serving as makeshift cemeteries marking the graves of those lost. The fierce struggle for the fortress of Omeonta dragged on for nearly 3 years, an arduous, grueling ordeal marked by relentless cold, bloody assaults, daring raids, and the hardships of trench warfare. During this extended period, the command structure of the alliance shifted multiple times, reflecting the chaos and desperation surrounding the conflict. The army was reinforced with fresh recruits, among whom were many former slaves promised their freedom in exchange for their service, adding to the diverse and often unpredictable composition of the forces. Meanwhile, the Brazilian Navy, adorned with newly built ironclads, finally managed to break through the formidable batteries protecting Curupayty and Umeonta. It was only in August of 1868, after a heroic and prolonged defense, that the remnants of the Umeonta garrison, battered by hunger and ravaged by disease, finally abandoned the fortress. Although the fall of Paraguay's Sevastopol dealt a heavy blow to the nation's morale, it did not break leader López's unwavering resolve to continue resisting. The war, far from being over, was merely entering its most terrifying and chaotic final phase, the last act of destruction and madness that would soon unfold. While the fiercest battles raged along the southern borders, with brave Paraguayan soldiers entrenched in muddy trenches amid torrents of blood, an equally harrowing tragedy was unfolding far in the heart of the country, behind the front lines. This war demanded an unimaginable level of total commitment from Paraguay's tiny nation, transforming the country into a single, sprawling military camp. From the old men with graying hair to infants still in swaddling clothes, every member of society was conscripted into some form of war effort, either as soldiers, laborers, or victims. Overseeing this colossal and relentless effort was a dictator whose increasing paranoia turned the nation's struggle into an internal nightmare. This ruler's cruelty and suspicion intensified as the war dragged on, transforming what should have been a united effort against external enemies into a brutal fight against the very people he was supposed to lead and protect. From the first days of the conflict, the entire Paraguayan economy had been mobilized onto wartime footing. Men enlisted and marched to the front lines, while women bore the heavy burden of agricultural work, cultivating the land, planting maize and cassava, and harvesting crops to feed the armies. It was Paraguayan women, who are since affectionately called Los Residentes, who became the true heroines of the nation. They worked tirelessly to till the soil, tend the fields, and gather harvests, ensuring a steady supply of food for soldiers and civilians alike. Many of these women also supported the war effort by working in hospitals, caring for countless wounded, sick, and dying, showing extraordinary compassion. When metal supplies ran low for manufacturing cannons and firearms, they sacrificed precious family heirlooms and church bells, melting down the sacred metal to produce weapons and ammunition in makeshift arsenals, notably in the city of Asunción. Their resilience and self-sacrifice became legendary across the country. The government mobilized every available resource for the war effort. New military factories sprang into existence, staffed by European engineers working alongside Paraguayan workers to produce gunpowder, shells, and even repair damaged weaponry. Medical professionals battled epidemics using indigenous Guarani knowledge of medicinal herbs, which proved vital in caring for the wounded and preventing disease from spreading further. The entire nation contributed to the war effort. Clothing factories in villages woven by women produced cotton uniforms for soldiers, while communities across Paraguay worked with remarkable ingenuity and dedication. It was a collective effort, an extraordinary display of patriotism and perseverance. However, as time wore on and the war stretched into its long, dark months, the initial wave of victory and optimism faded. Reports from the front grew increasingly dire, and the atmosphere throughout the country changed dramatically. The euphoric hope that had sustained the Paraguayan people in the early days was gradually replaced by fatigue, deprivation, and a growing sense of dread. The unity that once carried them through the darkest hours of the conflict now faced the heavy weight of exhaustion, and the chaos of war seeped into every corner of daily life. Despite their unwavering determination, the nation was inching toward an uncertain and increasingly bleak future, its spirit battered yet unbroken. That fear was fueled not only by the constant threat posed by enemy forces but also by the growing suspicion and paranoia of Solán López himself. His failures on the battlefield, often the result of his own strategic miscalculations and the overwhelming superiority of his adversaries, he insisted were due solely to conspiracies and treachery. This suspicion, which had always been part of his temperament, now blossomed into an almost monstrous paranoia. A relentless hunt for traitors commenced, turning into a brutal, indiscriminate campaign. Any careless word, any fleeting doubt about victory, could cost a person their life. Arrests and executions became ordinary occurrences, a grim daily reality under López's rule. Anyone suspected even slightly of disloyalty or dissent risked being dragged into this relentless terror. Foreigners residing in Paraguay were accused of espionage and swiftly imprisoned, their innocent lives shattered without fair trial. High-ranking officials and military officers who dared to voice opinions differing from the marshal's views vanished without trace, their dissent swiftly silenced. The climax of this dark period came in the form of the infamous San Fernando tribunals in the year 1868, following the fall of Humeda. As the army retreated northward, López claimed to have uncovered a vast conspiracy and intricate plot involving hundreds of individuals, from high-ranking military officers and diplomats to members of his own family. In his feverish mind, he envisioned enemies everywhere, rivals plotting to overthrow and kill him, then surrender the country to the Allies. This delusional suspicion ignited a wave of mass arrests and brutal interrogations. People were forced into false confessions, compelled to denounce themselves and others. When brought before the military tribunals, courts that merely formalized predetermined death sentences, a myriad of accused individuals faced swift justice. Under these verdicts, former presidents, ministers, judges, dozens of elite officers, and generals were executed. Even clergy, including the Bishop of Asunción and many priests, were not spared. They were shot without mercy. The horror extended beyond the political and military elite, striking López's own family too. His brothers, Venancio and Benigno, were accused of treason, subjected to grim tortures, and ultimately executed. Their sisters were beaten with whips, and even his elderly mother was detained and held in deplorable conditions. López ruthlessly eliminated anyone he perceived as a threat to his absolute rule, draining the nation's vitality and stripping the military of its most experienced commanders. His mistress, Eliza Lynch, is believed by many to have not only failed to oppose the ongoing terror but to have actively encouraged it, settling old scores with her enemies. By the end of that year, Paraguay found itself fighting on two fronts. To the south, its exhausted army held the advancing allies at bay, while in the rear, the country's own ruler waged a campaign of annihilation against his own people, eliminating the cultural and political elite and sowing an atmosphere of universal dread. The nation had been transformed into a wasteland, where death at the hands of enemy bullets on the front lines sometimes seemed a more merciful fate than execution at the hands of López's secret police. Amidst this internal and external chaos, a new, terrifying phase of the war was taking shape, one in which children, not men, would become combatants. The fall of the fortress at Meta in August of that year marked the beginning of the end. The grand bastion that had held the line against the Allies for 3 years finally succumbed. Its fall opened the way for the advance along the Paraguay River. The Brazilian Navy, which had now come to dominate the waterways unchallenged, moved decisively toward the Paraguayan capital, signaling that the conflict was entering its final phases. The army of the Allies, now led by the talented and energetic Brazilian military commander Marquis de Caxias, who would later be awarded the title of Duke, began an unstoppable advance toward the north. This marked the start of a relentless push that would change the course of history for the nation. Meanwhile, Solán López and the remnants of his battered forces faced a long, arduous retreat, one that would evolve into a painful and tragic ordeal, a true agony for the entire nation. Despite the dire circumstances, López was determined not to surrender. He swiftly organized a new defensive line south of Asunción, along the Paquisari stream. Exploiting the advantageous features of the terrain, the Paraguayan defenders once again dug extensive, multi-kilometer trenches and installed artillery batteries. Yet, their strength was severely depleted. Their army, exhausted by years of combat, hunger, and disease, was now reinforced mainly by untrained teenagers and aging men. Nevertheless, these defenders fought with a bravery that bordered on desperation, refusing to capitulate without a fierce fight. Not wanting to engage in a costly, frontal assault that could lead to even greater losses, Marquis de Caxias devised a brilliant improvisation. While part of his forces feigned attacks from the front, he himself, with the core of his troops, carried out a daring and complex flanking maneuver. He undertook a perilous march through the region's treacherous swamps and marshlands of the Gran Chaco, constructing an improvised 11-kilometer road out of palm trunks to facilitate his movement. Crossing the Paraguay River north of the Paraguayan positions, his forces then penetrated deep into enemy territory, catching the defenders off guard and enveloping their rear. This strategic trap was now set. By December of 1868, a series of bloody battles unfolded, known historically as the Decembrada or December Campaign. In the fierce clashes at Itaro and Avara, the Paraguayan defenders suffered crushing defeats. Their last stronghold, the fortress of Angostura, was completely encircled. The decisive battle at Primero de Valentina, which began on December 27, resulted in the total annihilation of the remaining Paraguayan army, commanded by López himself. The marshal barely escaped capture, abandoning his troops in a desperate retreat into the mountains. He managed to evade his pursuers. His escape cleared the way for the conquest of Asunción, the capital. On the 1st of January, the advancing Allied forces finally entered the city. Most of the inhabitants had already fled, and the city was left defenseless, ripe for plunder. Over the following days, soldiers of the Allied armies, especially the Uruguayan contingents, began looting and destroying everything in sight. Palace buildings, churches, private residences, archives, libraries, and priceless works of art were either looted or destroyed. The beautiful city, which architect Carlos Antonio López had diligently built and developed over many years, was now reduced to ruins. For the victors, the war was officially over. The capital was captured, the Paraguayan army was shattered, and the dictator López had fled.
A temporary government made up of Paraguayan émigrés and collaborators was swiftly established in Asunción.
This provisional authority immediately declared Solán López a criminal and outlaw. The Argentine president, Dumaite, along with most of his army, returned home satisfied that the campaign had ended. It seemed that only the capture of the fugitive dictator remained.
However, López had no intention of surrendering.
In his mind, the war was not yet lost as long as he himself survived. He fell back into the interior regions of the country, into the rugged, forested hills of the Cordillera. Along with him, several thousand surviving soldiers and a large mass of civilians, the women, children, and elderly, migrated into the wilderness. Many of them held fervent faith in their marshal or, at the very least, feared his wrath. Thus, the most tragic chapter of the war began, the mountainous phase of the conflict. López proclaimed a series of small towns as temporary capitals, moving from one to another in a desperate attempt to sustain some semblance of governmental authority. He carried with him the remnants of the national administration and a multitude of refugees, embodying the final, hopeless struggle against the advancing tide of enemy forces. By this point, his army had dwindled to a ragtag collection of boys aged between 10 and 15, disabled individuals, and frail elders. The shortage of weapons was desperate, scarce firearms and outdated rifles were all they had left. Their condition was dire, many succumbed to starvation, contagious diseases, and exhaustion, slowly fading away amid the relentless march through dense jungles and rugged mountains. This arduous trek was constantly marred by violent skirmishes with the pursuing Brazilian forces, now commanded by none other than Gaston Orlean, the son-in-law of the Brazilian emperor, who bore the title of Count de. Despite the hopelessness of their situation, López pressed on, demanding impossible feats from his remaining followers. He remained obsessed with rooting out supposed traitors within his ranks, showing no mercy to those who hesitated or expressed despair. His cruelty extended to the most shocking of acts. He ordered the execution of his own mother, accusing her of attempting to desert the cause. Only the intervention of Count de, who learned of this atrocity and sent a stern message to López, saved her life. The message was clear: if López dared to murder his mother, he would face no mercy himself. This final phase of the conflict was no longer a conventional war, it was a sickening, collective act of self-destruction. The nation was being led toward the abyss by a leader driven by madness, and what unfolded was a tragedy of colossal proportions. It culminated in a last, desperate battle, a clash of seasoned veterans facing off against children with painted mustaches, fighting to the bitter end. History has recorded many instances of heroism and sacrifice amid war's chaos, but few stories are as tragic and monstrous as the Battle of Acostanu, also known as the Battle of Campo Grande. That confrontation emerged as a powerful symbol of Paraguay's complete annihilation, the final act in its long, painful agony. It was the pinnacle of warfare's insanity, where not only men but also children were thrown into the inferno of battle. In Paraguay, August 16 remains a day of mourning and remembrance, observed as Children's Day, a somber occasion to honor the last battalion of the Republic. By the time August of 1669 arrived, López's retreating army was nothing more than a pitiful shell of its former self. It had ceased to be a regular fighting force, transforming instead into a desperate crowd of exhausted refugees. They were guarded only by a handful of veterans and hastily assembled units composed of teenagers and children. The pursuing Brazilian army, numbering around 20,000 men and led by Count de, was resolute in ending López's campaign once and for all. On the 16th of August, 1869, they caught up with the rear guard of the Paraguayan column on the broad plains near Acostanu, not far from the town of Eusebio Ayala. This rear guard, which served to protect López himself and the main civilian stragglers, consisted of an estimated 3,000 to 6,000 fighters. Commanded by one of López's bravest and most loyal generals, the veteran Umapa Bernardino Cabonero, this contingent faced an even more harrowing reality: the majority of its soldiers were boys aged from 9 to 15 years. To mask their youth and intimidation, the children were instructed to affix fake beards and mustaches crafted from corn husks and grass to their faces. Their makeshift weapons were equally inadequate: old muskets, machetes, spears fashioned from sharpened sticks, all serving as symbols of their desperate fight for survival. When the Brazilian cavalry and infantry launched their attack, they anticipated only a token resistance. Instead, they were met with a furious display of desperation, a storm of fury from children driven by the ravages of war, torment, and the instinct to defend their homeland with every ounce of their fading strength. This tragic confrontation would etch itself forever into the collective memory, a ruthless testament to the brutality inflicted upon a nation pushed to the brink of annihilation. Inspired by the few remaining veterans still alive, the Paraguayan child soldiers fought with an almost inhuman level of courage and resolve. They stood their ground with unwavering determination, willing to face death rather than allow their enemies to break through and threaten the retreat of their commanding officer, their leader, the marshal. The battle that ensued lasted more than 8 hours, transforming into a brutal and bloody slaughter, a savage conflict that would be remembered as one of the most savage encounters of its kind. The Brazilian forces possessed overwhelming numerical superiority and far better equipped weaponry, launching relentless wave after wave of attacks against the entrenched Paraguayan positions. Witnesses recounted chilling stories that sent shivers down the spine, tales of small boys, too fragile and weak to wield a gun, clinging desperately to the legs of Brazilian cavalrymen in a desperate attempt to pull them off their horses. Many wounded fighters, lying injured on the ground, continued to fight with machetes in their hands, until they were finally felled by bayonets or gunfire. At one critical moment, in an act of desperate resistance, Paraguayan women accompanying the retreat set fire to dry grass on the battlefield to halt the advancing enemy. The flames quickly spread across the field, catching their own camp ablaze, a place where many injured compatriots and mothers with infants huddled in helpless panic. The screams of those burned alive mixed with the deafening chaos of the battle, creating a nightmarish scene of horror. As the day drew to a close, the horrendous conflict came to an end. The terrain of the battlefield, now known as the blood-soaked plain, was covered with thousands of corpses, a horrifying testament to the ferocity of the combat. Nearly the entire Paraguayan contingent had been annihilated, with estimates indicating that about 2,000 children perished in the massacre. The losses suffered by the Brazilian soldiers were comparatively much smaller, yet even they could not remain unmoved in the face of such tragic devastation. Observing the sight before him, Count D, one of the high-ranking officers, struggled to hold back tears as he gazed over the blood-stained field, filled with the bodies of young boys whose innocence had been torn away forever. The Battle of Acosta New, in truth, held no strategic importance whatsoever. It merely postponed, for a matter of days, the inevitable end of the conflict. However, its symbolic and moral significance was immense, a powerful reminder to the world of just how far the Paraguayan nation had descended into self-destruction, driven by a blind loyalty to their leader and their homeland. The events served as a horrific indictment against Solon Lopez, who had shown no hesitation in sacrificing the future of his country, its children, all in a reckless attempt to save his own skin and cling to a fragile, fleeting power. After the catastrophe at Acosta New, Lopez was left with no army to command. All that remained was a small, dwindling handful of loyal officers and soldiers, his mistress Eliza Lynch, and several hundred exhausted civilians, battered and demoralized. He continued his frantic retreat northeastward, heading towards the border with Brazil, pursued relentlessly by hostile troops. His final moments of resistance were approaching, and he was aware that his last stand would soon come. The endgame was near, and he knew that he would have to face his fate at the last refuge, a small stream called Sercora. There, he would deliver his final words before meeting his death, along with the battered remnants of his homeland. Following the bloody battle, the remnants of the Paraguayan nation's retreat transformed into an endless journey of suffering and despair. A handful of survivors, led by their broken yet unyielding marshal, made their way through the wild, uninhabited jungles to the northeast. This was no longer an army but a ghostly specter of an army, a column of living dead, a desperate procession of survivors haunted by loss and hopelessness. Hunger, sickness, and relentless skirmishes with the pursuing Brazilian forces claimed dozens of lives every day. Solon Lopez, sinking deeper into the abyss of paranoia, began executing his last remaining comrades at the slightest suspicion of treachery. He carried not only the remnants of his waning power but also the burden of his family, including Eliza Lynch and their children, who shared with him all the hardships and horrors of this final, tragic retreat. By the end of February in the year of 1870, the forlorn remnants of Lopez's defeated column made their final stand along the banks of Cerro Cara Creek, amidst the wooded hills not far from the Brazilian border. Their number had dwindled drastically, fewer than 500 soldiers remained, the majority being wounded or incapacitated officers, with only a handful of able-bodied fighters left to defend themselves. They were exhausted, broken in body and spirit, with virtually no ammunition at their disposal. It seemed as though nature itself was preparing to bear witness to the final act of a long and tragic saga. Early on the morning of the 1st of March, 1870, the pursuit reached its climax when Brazilian troops under General José Antonio de Araújo Carrera finally caught up with the retreating forces near the creek. The attack was swift and unexpected, catching the remnants of Lopez's army off guard.
The sparse Paraguayan sentries were overwhelmed instantly, and the Brazilian cavalry stormed into their camp with relentless force. Despite a desperate and valiant effort to resist, their hope was fleeting. The few surviving officers and soldiers rallied around their marshal in a last, brave stand, a thwarted effort to oppose the inevitable. Salvador Lopez, dressed in his parade uniform as a marshal, fought side by side with his men. During the chaos, he was struck with a spear in the abdomen and later received a brutal sword blow to the head. Despite the grievous wounds, Lopez managed to break free from the encirclement. With the most determined effort, helped by a handful of officers, he reached the edge of the creek. But fate was harsh. A Brazilian general was there to meet him. Seeing the fallen enemy, the general extended an offer, surrender and hope for mercy. Yet Lopez, bleeding profusely, remained steadfastly true to his principles. Summoning his remaining strength, he drew his revolver and, trembling, whispered words that would be remembered forever, words that became his epitaph: "I die with my country." With this final declaration, he made a last attempt at resistance but was immediately pierced by a spear thrust from one of the Brazilian soldiers. Thus, by that nameless creek in a remote jungle, the life of a man who had stood as a symbol of hope and a source of curse for 6 long years came to a brutal end. His remaining loyal comrades, including the vice president and ministers, perished alongside him.
His eldest son, the 15-year-old Pancho, a colonel in his father's army, also fell, shielding his mother from harm.
Elisa Lynch, Lopez's widow, was captured by the victorious soldiers.
When they led her to the body of her husband, witnesses recall she fell to her knees and uttered a piercing words, an accusation and a lament: "This is the civilization you bring." She was granted permission to bury her husband and son, and with her own hands, along with other captured women, she dug a shallow grave, interring the bodies of those she loved most deeply. Lopez's death marked the end of the Paraguayan War, a conflict that had been the longest, bloodiest, and most senseless in the history of South America. The war's conclusion was not merely an end to a brutal struggle but the death of an entire world for Paraguayans. The country lay in ruins, its cities were shattered, fields abandoned, and the human toll was catastrophic. Paraguay had been almost annihilated as a nation, its once vibrant land left decimated. A new, equally tragic chapter of its history was about to begin, a story of survival, slow recovery, and painful rebirth from the ashes of destruction. When the final gunshot had echoed at Cerro Cara, over Paraguay descended a deep silence, as if the very earth mourned the loss of its youngest and bravest. This was not the peaceful silence of the world, but the ominous quiet of a graveyard. The devastating aftermath of a 6-year war had unfolded in a manner that far surpassed even the darkest fears, creating what could only be described as apocalyptic. A nation that once thrived as a prosperous and proud South American tiger had been thrust decades back in its development, pushed to the brink of total obliteration. The demographic toll was nothing short of unimaginable. Precise figures remain a subject of debate, but even the most conservative estimates paint a horrifying picture. Before the conflict, the population ranged from 500,000 to over 1,300,000 inhabitants. Today, no more than 220,000 to 300,000 individuals remained alive. Among them, the number of men over the age of 15 was astonishingly low, barely around 28,000. Some estimates claim that Paraguay had lost up to 90% of its adult male population. As a result, the country transformed into a nation predominantly composed of women, children, and a limited number of surviving men. In the decades that followed the devastating war, it became common to see families where a single man was responsible for supporting 10 or even 20 women and children, an outcome that was previously unthinkable. The government was forced to legalize polygamy in an effort to somehow facilitate the rebuilding of the weakened nation. The economy was wiped out in its entirety. State-owned plantations, factories, arsenals, components that once formed the backbone of Paraguay's unique economic structure were destroyed or fell into ruin. Fertile lands were abandoned, overgrown with weeds and pests, and left to decay. The country, which had previously maintained no external debts, was burdened with enormous reparations that extended over many decades, further straining its fragile future. During this period, the country was occupied for several years by its neighbors, primarily Brazil and Argentina. These allied powers treated Paraguay as a colony, exploiting its resources and its people as though it belonged to them. The occupation resulted not only in economic exploitation but also territorial losses. Although the occupying forces failed to realize all their expansionist ambitions outlined in their secret treaties, internal rivalry between Brazil and Argentina prevented full domination. As a consequence, Paraguay lost roughly 140,000 square kilometers, which equated to nearly a quarter of its pre-war territory. Argentina annexed the Misiones province and parts of the Gran Chaco region, while Brazil incorporated disputed border areas into its own territory. The road to recovery was long and painful. The nation, kneeling under the weight of destruction and despair, gradually began to rise from the ashes, each step forward a testament to resilience and perseverance. Women, in particular, played a crucial role in this arduous rebuilding process. It was they who rejuvenated the shattered economy, cultivated the land, and, in a very real sense, gave birth anew to the Paraguayan nation. It took more than half a century for the population to nearly reach its pre-war numbers, demonstrating both the depth of the scars left by the conflict and the extraordinary strength of those who endured. The war left an indelible mark on the collective consciousness of Paraguayans, as well as on the regional psyche of Latin America. Not only did it scar the national identity of Paraguay, but it also inflicted heavy losses and financial burdens upon the victorious countries. Among them, Brazil bore the greatest toll. Its enormous war expenditures led to increased national debt, materializing as a significant financial crisis that ultimately contributed to the fall of its monarchy in 1889. Following the war, the Brazilian army, having gained strength and confidence from its experience, became a formidable political force, asserting influence in national affairs. Yet, perhaps the most enduring and complex question arising from this devastating conflict is, what were its true causes and who were the real responsible parties? To this day, historians and societies around the world remain divided, unable to reach a consensus. The war's origins and the culpability of its leaders continue to be subjects of intense debate, reflecting the deep ambiguities and unresolved tensions that have persisted for more than a century. One perspective, which is often considered the traditional view within the countries of the Triple Alliance, places the entire blame for the devastating conflict squarely on the madness and excessive ambitions of the Paraguayan dictator, Francisco Solano López. According to this narrative, López is portrayed as a ruthless and bloodthirsty tyrant who dragged his nation into a suicidal war, while the alliance members are seen simply as defenders, acting in self-defense against an aggressor and striving to free the Paraguayan people from his oppressive rule. This version depicts the war as a tragic consequence of one man's reckless quest for power, emphasizing the destructive nature of López's leadership and the senseless bloodshed that ensued. In contrast, another, more revisionist view, particularly popular within Paraguay itself and among leftist intellectual circles across Latin America, interprets the war as the outcome of imperialist strategies pursued by Brazil and Argentina. This perspective claims that, under the influence of British capital, these neighboring nations sought to dismantle Paraguay's unique, independent, and self-sufficient economic model. Their goal was to open Paraguay's markets to their manufactured goods, thereby dominating its economy and subordinating it within a larger imperialist framework. From this standpoint, Francisco Solano López is seen not as a villain but as a tragic hero and a martyr who fought valiantly to preserve national sovereignty against external pressures and territorial encroachments. As is often the case when examining complex historical events, the truth lies somewhere in the middle. The Paraguayan War, also known as the War of the Triple Alliance, was born out of a tangled web of causes: personal ambitions of López, imperial aspirations of Brazil, attempts at revenge by Argentina, political instability in Uruguay, and the general geopolitical tensions gripping the region. These intertwined factors created a perfect storm, leading to one of the bloodiest conflicts in Latin American history. Today, the memory of Francisco Solano López is preserved in the national pantheon of heroes in Asunción. His remains were solemnly reinterred there in 1936, honoring his significance for Paraguay. For many Paraguayan citizens, López remains one of the greatest national heroes, symbolizing patriotism, resilience, and the fierce desire for independence. Conversely, for much of the international community, he remains one of the most controversial and ominous figures in history, an historical character whose deeds continue to evoke debate and mixed feelings. The story of Lopez in his homeland, scarred by the horrors of the most brutal war on the continent, serves as an enduring reminder of the destructive potential of pride, ambition, and fanaticism. It exemplifies how these destructive forces can lead nations down dark and tragic paths, often at an enormous cost. The war's aftermath underscores the tremendous sacrifices made in the name of independence, sacrifices that, embedded in tragedy, forged the collective memory of a nation that endured hellish suffering but ultimately survived to tell its story. We thank you for spending this time with us, delving into the depths of this historical narrative. If this story resonated with you, we encourage you to reflect further on the complex lessons of this turbulent chapter. As we continue to explore the most mysterious and profound pages of the past, many more journeys through history await, promising to reveal hidden truths and enduring mysteries from times long gone.